On the Climber Dad channel, we've been talking a lot about climbing holds because I'm writing a book about unlocking climbing holds and the process that goes into making them yourself. But today we're going to take a little bit different approach to the video, and we're going to talk about the climbing walls themselves. DIY home climbing walls. I also sell build plans on Etsy for making your own climbing walls. So if that's something that you'd be interested in, please go check out my Etsy store. I will leave a link down in the description. With this video, we are going to cover the plywood to make the panels, the framing and the lumber that you need to do that, the type of fasteners that I like to use, the T-nuts that you're going to use. Let's get going. Now I'm going to mention all of the different types of plywood that I've used to make climbing walls, both good and bad. And that way you can make an informed decision yourself. I know it can be very overwhelming when you're walking down the aisle at the big box store looking at all the different plywoods and things that you can use. First, let's talk about the thickness that you want to use. The thickness of plywood that you want to use in climbing walls today is 3/4 of an inch. Now, in the past, people have gotten away with using 5/8 inch, and it's lasted pretty well. I don't know if maybe they were just growing trees better or what, but today you want to use 3/4 or better. Good luck finding thicker than 3/4 inch. If you're on the metric standard, 19 millimeter, 18, maybe 17. I'm not sure about 17 though. 17, I think that's getting a little bit too thin. So what type of plywood or panels do you need to use? So the absolute cheapest that I have ever used, and this is because I was on such a tight budget and I didn't know any better, and that would be using OSB. Now this is a little bit thinner. You would never use something that's this thin, but it gives you a good idea on what it is. And OSB stands for Oriented Strand Board. It's basically wood chips that are pressed and glued together. The quality of glue that's used and the pressure to put this together makes a huge difference on how well this works. I don't recommend it, even though it is your cheapest option, because there is a potential of blowout, and the difference in quality between the different manufacturers is pretty massive. I will tell you that if you are daring enough to use OSB, it is more flexible, so you're going to want to have a little bit more structure behind your wall in the framing. And don't get the absolute cheapest stuff. There's a reason that it's the cheapest stuff. And it's not going to work that great. You're going to be climbing on it and you're going to start to hear it crack, and you're going to think, is this hold going to come through the wall? And it might. So I would avoid this. There's some better ways that we can come up with cheaper solutions. The next type of plywood that you're going to look for is BCX. The B stands for the quality of one of the sides. So this is BCX right here. And if you notice, this surface is a little bit better than this surface. So you're going to have a back side and a front side. The front side is the B. A is going to be the best. So if you find an ABX, I haven't seen an ABX in a long time, but I imagine it's out there. That surface is going to be better. But BCX works well. The X stands for exterior, which means that the wood glue is going to be pretty decent. Now, BCX is kind of a construction grade plywood. There are going to be voids in it, and there's going to be some issues that it'll work well, but it's not quite as nice to work with as our next option, in my opinion, of course, which is cabinet grade pine plywood. This is 3/4 inch, and it seems to be a little bit more rigid, flat, and there are more layers, which gives it strength. When you're picking this stuff out, and this is true with all of your plywood, look at the side. And if you see a light red or a pink glue that's in between your layers, don't get it. That stuff is just not great. I'm pretty sure it's coming from China, and they don't care how good of plywood they send to us, or send to the rest of the world. If it has that light red or pink glue, just avoid it. I've worked with that stuff a lot, and I've had crazy stuff with that, like pebbles in between the layers of plywood, or just random things like maybe bone, string. I've had string come through, which string is actually not that uncommon, but a pebble is, and I've hit a pebble with a saw while I was cutting through some of that stuff that has pink. So avoid that, please. One step up from there, actually it's a pretty big step in my opinion, is going to be hardwood plywood. Now, hardwood plywood is typically found at your big box stores. It's going to be the most expensive stuff that's there. Typically at time of recording this, it's like around $80 a sheet. Now, if you're deciding between the maple or the oak or the birch, all that is the very top surface. So if you're going to leave it raw wood, then pick the stuff that looks the nicest to you, because the core is what we're after, and the core is the same throughout them. In fact, what I would recommend is just out of the hardwood plywoods, choose whichever one is cheapest, because the cores are going to be the same. The core is going to be typically a Douglas fir, but it will be on the grade of hardwood in there. Okay, there's several different species, and it's not guaranteed which species is going to be in that core, at least the last time I checked with that, but it's usually Douglas fir. The hardwood plywood is nice and rigid and works great for climbing walls. The veneer on the top surface is super thin, so if you are going to leave it that wood grain, be careful as you're sanding those edges, because that veneer comes off pretty quick when you're sanding. Now, the king of the castle as far as climbing wall panels go is definitely Baltic birch. So you want to get the 19 millimeter Baltic birch. It has 13 layers in here. It's also going to be a solid core, usually. I mean, look and make sure that it's marine grade Baltic birch. You're never going to have a spot or a void that's on the inside, which makes a huge difference. It's also going to be birch all the way through, and because those 13 layers, this stuff is really good. But I'm going to say it one more time, avoid the stuff that has that light pink or red color in between the layers. That is probably birch plywood, not Baltic birch plywood, and there is a huge difference. Avoid that. The Baltic birch stuff, man, you can't really beat it. It is really, really good stuff. Now, there are some even more expensive and better plywoods out there, but I've never used them. There's a product called Applewood. I think that's probably going to be even better, but I just don't have the funds, and this stuff works so well. Why bother? So to review the plywood, my absolute favorite stuff out of the box store is right here, the Radia Pine cabinet grade plywood. It just works really well. It's fairly light, and it does a great job. But any of these, whether the BCX, cabinet grade pine, hardwood, you're going to get what you pay for, but they'll all work. And of course, king of the castle, is going to be your Baltic Birch. Let's talk about the fasteners that we use through our home climbing walls. Now, I like to use this brand right here, but you don't need to specifically use this brand. You do want to look for a construction screw. It's going to be a little bit stronger than your typical screw for, say, drywall. It's going to hold better. It's going to have a different type of head on it, and the threads will bite down better. Also, don't grab a deck screw thinking that it's a construction screw. For some reason, the decking screws just don't have the same gripping power of just a regular construction screw. When you're connecting plywood to plywood, I use a 1 1/4 inch screw. When I'm going from plywood to, say, lumber or the frame, I'm using at least a 2-inch screw. And when I'm connecting my frame together, lumber to lumber, I'm using either 2.5 or 3-inch screws. Now let's talk about the T-nuts. There's 3 different types of T-nuts that I would say to get for a climbing wall. Before we get into the different types though, what size should you use? Well, here in the United States, you're going to use a 3/8 16 thread. So a 3/8 diameter with a 16 thread pitch. In Europe, I believe it's a 10 millimeter, but I have no, I think it's a, comment down below if you know. The different types of T-nuts that you can use are first going to start out with what's on this panel right here. These are a little bit worse for the wear because this has been outside for a few years, getting all kind of rusty. This is a 4-prong T-nut, and it works pretty well for climbing walls, except for one issue. They will back out over time, and then you've got an issue with the bolt getting stuck on the T-nut itself, especially if it's cross-threaded. Not fun to deal with. Most commercial climbing gyms use this T-nut right here. This is a 3-screw flange T-nut with a round base. And you can get this at almost any website that sells climbing holds. They will also sell this guy right here. And they work great as well. You're gonna be able to get them at a lot of different places, and they work fabulous. What I think is the Cadillac of T-nuts, the cat's meow, the best of the best is gonna be this T-nut right here, made by Escape. Now, Escape designed this specifically for climbing walls, and to my knowledge, it is the only T-nut that has been designed just for climbing walls. Waltopia might have one, but I've not been able to use that T-nut or get that T-nut for home climbing wall builds. But this is easily accessible. One of the features that it has is a barrel that doesn't have threads at the very beginning. That's to help you line up the bolt and to minimize the opportunity for someone to cross-thread that bolt. It's also a little bit thicker material, and the flange on the back is wider, giving these screws a little bit more leverage to keep it in place. Also, because that's wider, you only need 2 screws, which makes the install a little bit faster. I like that T-nut. Well, there's a quick rundown of the materials that you need to build your own home climbing wall. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. And if you want to go check out those build plans, I would really appreciate it. Go over to climberdad.com for an extra discount on that. And I will see you next time right here on Climber Dad.